Start the recording now. Okay, and a few more people joined. Excellent. Okay, without further ado, I hope you all can see the slides. A few words about me. Some of you know me. I have over 10 years of experience delivering SaaS solutions, certified enterprise architect, certified SaaS architect, and I represent Analytium, a SaaS partner and reseller. And we are working with VIA quite a lot lately, especially migrating people into the cloud and flashing solutions. Now, in this session, I would like to cover very briefly different SAS VIA runtimes available, and then specifics on the CAS sessions, libraries, and how to run SAS 9 code in SAS VIA. I just came out of another call where again it's been raised that some people still have this a bit of a confusion that SAS 9 code cannot run in VIA. I'll cover some of that. I'll cover some of the gotchas that you need to watch out when migrating into VIA when running SAS 9 code there. And of course, running CAS code as well. Okay, so many people ask, what is CAS? CAS stands for Cloud Analytics Service, and it's a new execution engine in the simplest way. It's an engine that's specifically designed to run a multi-process, multi-threaded execution of a new type of SAS code in memory. That's in essence what you need to keep in mind. If you take VIA platform, it now under the covers has two execution engines. There's two programs that can execute SAS code. One of them is often referred as SAS Compute Server. You might also have heard it as a SAS Spree. And in essence, it's a SAS 9 that wrapped and included into VIA. And alongside of that, you have CAS. They very much are separate and at the same time within the same package. Now, if in the past you worked with in the past on SAS 9, you would always use compute server. I'll touch on the differences. Now, the important part is when it comes to CAS, the way you work with CAS is now different. The principle of how you work with CAS is different to when it was with SAS 9. When in SAS 9, you would use something like a ProcSQL or data step and start reading the data step without moving it anywhere line by line. With CAS, completely different. Your first step, and it's essential all the time, is to start the CAS session. You can't do any work without starting the CAS session. The second, you either will use a pre-assigned CAS lib, which is it's like a SAS library, but only for the CAS datasets or the data sources. And for you to work with the data in a visual interfaces, such as visual analytics, visual statistics, and so on, you need to load the data into memory, including when you're calling on it from SAS Studio. Only once data has been loaded into memory, you can start leveraging the power of CAS to work with that. This loop is very important. I'm going to be referring to it throughout the presentation. Once you made the changes to the data, you can only make changes to the data when it's in memory. Only then you get a chance to save it back onto the disk to persist it. If you don't save it, once your session is finished and that data set wasn't public, wasn't global, that is, available to other sessions, your changes will not persist. If VIA will be shut down while you have made the changes only to the in-memory data set, again, your changes will not persist. A very different way of working with it, but it also brings a lot of advantages of it. When you work with CAS, you need to keep in mind that you need to use CAS-enabled procs and data steps. And you also have access now to the CAS-L language, which is a language specifically designed with the CAS actions to work with data. Again, I have about 40 slides or so I'm going to rush through, but feel free to ask any questions. Now, how does it work, especially with the SAS Studio, when many people access SAS Studio to run the code? First of all, when you sign in to the SAS Studio, let me skip that through. There you go. When you sign in to the SAS Studio, first of all, what happens, you connect to what you can think of as a SAS 9, first of all. The second step that you need to do is to launch your SAS CAS session. CAS session can be launched with a simple statement. I'll show you later on the later slides. After you've done the CAS session, then you connect it to the CAS controller. That's not good enough. The next part is you need to get to your data and load that data into memory. And only when you worked into the memory, then you could start submitting the CAS code to work with that. It could be a simple data step, but nevertheless, if you want to work with the CAS data, that's the steps you need to follow. you can completely automate that with the pre-assigned libraries. Once you work in CAS, you can start working in parallel in a multi-threaded way and really start processing gigabytes, if not terabytes of data very, very quickly. You must have heard that the CAS also comes with the concept of workers. So workers is one or several, not necessarily servers, but other processes usually run on a separate servers. When the data is loaded, you have a multiple ways of loading it, but you can spread that data equally between the workers. You can also make the data highly available, so duplicate data between the workers, and both speed up the process of loading the data in and working with it. Now, some of you know visual analytics on the SAS 9, and one of the drawbacks is loading the data into laser, which historically wasn't one of the fastest processes. On one of the projects that we're running right now, we've been able to load close to 700 gigabyte of data in memory and persist on a disk with only 2 workers in Azure. That's within 2 hours. So that's a significant increase in the throughput. Now, when it comes to the runtimes, this sample code, your standard SAS base code, you would need to do a few things to transform it into CAS or CAS friendly, and I'll cover that. There is also CAS L language that allows you to perform actions and information on the tables in a way that's a little bit similar to the way you would work in object-oriented language. And of course, how you do the transformation from one to another. Certain steps you would need to use like procas util to, for example, load the data in and out. But most importantly, some of your code, as long as you start referencing CAS libraries, your code doesn't need to change at all. So if I take a simple example like a data step, if you replace your work library with a CAS user library, and you make sure that your data set is there, your data step will work perfectly fine. So one of the key misconceptions that the SAS 9 code will not work on VIA. All of the SAS 9 code, you could copy paste it into VIA, it will work perfectly fine, but you will need to keep in mind about where it will execute. Would it execute on a SAS compute, i.e. SAS 9 context, or would it go into CAS? There are a lot of things to keep in mind where it will execute. I'll touch on some of the nuances later. Now let's have a closer look to the CAS. For you to start the session, if you open SAS Studio, start the session, it's as simple as CAS semicolon. That's it. Once you've done that, it will create a default session for you with the default parameters. You don't need to worry about anything else. We often get the feedback when we use these slides as a training session for the new users, for the migration, for the knowledge transfer, is how to automate this step. If you're using SAS Studio, the simplest way in a SAS Studio, go into Options, Auto Exec, add CAS semicolon to it, and every single time you start your SAS Studio, it will create a session for you. A quick tip there. Now, when it comes to CAS, and you can now access many more data sources. Where in the past with the SAS 9, you would access primarily databases, SAS 9 datasets, of course, perhaps SPRI files. Now with CAS, you can access all sorts of different files directly, including even images, Excel files, many different databases. With the VIA 4, they're introducing access to all sorts of different Azure storage types, blob storage types, you name it. Now with the CAS, you can access many more file types, and you really need to keep an eye on it because it's developing very, very, very fast. When you create the CAS library, you get to create many more options alongside of that. Your library, I'll probably go to the next slide straight away. Your library has these important options like should it be local or not. You could create your library just for yourself within your session, and that means you finish your session, it will finish. If you have the admin rights to the platform, you can create the global CAS libraries, and that means they will persist between the sessions. You could give the rights to those libraries to the environment manager. That means that other users can access them, and you could really control what they can do with that. The local, if in the past you think you had the work library and you would need to really play around with the configuration to change where the work going to go, but you still couldn't change the name of it, now you could nominate any CAS library as your, think of it like a work library, where you would like, if you don't specify any CAS lib, where the work is going to be. And of course, again, there's many, many more options there. When it comes to specifying how and where to load the data, you need to specify the lib name, so your base lib where data sets are being stored, where you're loading it from, and a CAS lib where you're loading it to. If, and that's important part to note, one of the little tips that we learned in our process of migrating the data, if your libref, which is limited, some of you know, to 8 characters, matches your CAS lib, which is not limited to 8 characters, but if they perfectly match one to another, then what's going to happen when you issue caslib underscore all assign, it will assign all the libraries for you straight away. It will always try to match the caslib to your lib name and assign them together in one go. You could, if you're not sure about these statements, I would suggest in SAS Studio, you open snippets provided by SAS, and you will find all these little tricky snippets already provided by SAS within that. On the right hand side, there's a small example. You see the difference the way the SAS Studio shows. A cloud with a little snowflake to it, that's your CAS library, and then the standard image of a library for SAS 9. And you see the difference between the two, what it looks like in SAS Studio. And again, many people expect to see data sets within CAS. Unless it's in memory, even within SAS Studio, you will not be able to see it. Now, when it comes to managing CAS libs, one of the easiest and best ways is to use procasutil. It allows you to do a variety of things, to see what kind of data sets available on the disk to be loaded into the library, what's already been loaded, what is in memory, execute any loads, and also execute any offloads if you need to do, as well as to persist information on the disk. Everything is done with the procasutil. While our main training session usually goes through a full list of details and all the options, I'm not going to focus on that now. I would suggest just to refer to the SAS documentation for a bit more information. But procasutil is your friend for loading, unloading, and changing. So like I mentioned, CAS supports all sorts of different files now, images and so on. They can be loaded directly from the databases. It has a great support for Oracle, for Microsoft SQL, for a whole range of others. If you have SAS Access engines, have a look, but most of them support CAS natively now. And depending on how you configured the data load in it, you have two ways of loading data. You can use a multi-threaded processing, and that means if you have your CAS library designed connected directly to the database, you will be able to utilize the parallel loading and load the segments of the data straight into CAS workers. Or alternatively, you could use the CAS controller to control how the data is being loaded to the workers. Again, if you load it in parallel, you could significantly increase the speed of load. Once you worked with the data, if you remember in the loop, you load it into memory, you make the changes, then you need to persist the data. The data persisted on the disk in a new format called SAS HDAT. So it's a completely different format to this SAS 9 one. The most important difference, this data set is memory mapped already. So it's persist data in a format that's very similar to how it's saved in memory. Why is that important? Once you have once you have your data in a SAS HDAT format, reloading it back into CAS is much, much faster because it doesn't need to do additional compute to be able to map it to memory. At the end of your work, you saved your data onto the disk, you send it somewhere else. It's a good idea to terminate your session. If you don't terminate, you just close the SAS. I believe the default timeout is 360 minutes. But your session that's not global will time out eventually, and anything that's in memory will be dropped out. And you can, of course, terminate all the sessions. It's good to tidy up after yourself at the end. Some of the there was a couple other slides that I might have hidden. Some of the other things to keep in mind, if you're not sure how your data is being treated, is it loaded in cloud, it's not, you execute a particular step. I will touch on some of it, that some of them execute in SAS 9, some of them execute in CAS. If you're not sure, a little trick to remember, put options message level equal I, and that will give you additional notes in your log. Every single time you execute the code, it will tell you if it's executing on CAS or SAS 9. Something to keep in mind until you get a hold of it. So yeah, you can run multiple sessions. You could list what's currently available. Oh yeah. So when it comes to code, now as it says on this slide, all the SAS 9 code will run within CAS, within VIA, perfectly fine, but not all of it will automatically run within CAS. So for example, you got your freak, SQL, proc SQL, pend, none of this will run in CAS. But what VIA will do, it will download the data for you into the compute environment, into compute context, execute the SAS 9 code, and then put data back in. Now, while this slide doesn't say it, there is a limit to how much data you could do. If you try to execute proc freak on a very large data set that being stored in memory, you will get an error, and that can be controlled through the options, but it will impact performance in some cases. All of the procedures, like for example, proc SQL, now there is a proc fed SQL, which is an ANSI compliant version of SQL, and that's available out of the box, completely multi-threaded, and works completely within CAS. That also means you have to rewrite, but in most cases, it's a very minor changes to convert proc SQL to proc fed SQL. Something to keep in mind. How we're doing in terms of time. Yeah, okay, almost done. Some of the procedures like proc mince, proc summary, proc report, proc tabulate, they will either run in SAS compute server or SAS cloud analytics services. Now, again, you will need to refer to the documentation to really understand which option will force which procedure to what execution context. Now, the important part here is if you're not sure, you could go back to the options, message equal I, and then it will tell you where it's executing. But it's depending on what options you pass to these procedures, that will impact where it's going to be executed at the end. And next one, and yeah, running SAS 9 code, like I mentioned before, once your data is already loaded in CAS, it's simply a matter of changing your library to the CAS library, and your code will execute perfectly fine. Now, just a couple more slides left. For the data step execution, if your data is stored in SAS 9, SAS compute server, it's always going to be single-threaded. Cloud analytics service is going to be single-threaded or multi-threaded. It's up to you how you would like to do it. By default, it's always going to be multi-threaded. It will break it up into pieces. I have another slide that shows that concrete example, but you could also force it to go single-threaded. Now, in what cases would you like to go single-threaded? If I go to this example, if you use the data step that's already running within CAS user, so on the CAS, and you do your subset and summary, you will not get a single total. You will get as many totals as the threads running on your computer or on your service. Now, that means that you will start getting a rather unexpected results, where before your data step would execute on SAS 9 and you will get only one total. Now you would get as many totals as there are sessions. And that means sometimes you either need to force it in the beginning to run single-threaded and then summarize it then, or do it later. But keep in mind that multi-threaded means that you might end up with more totals than you anticipate. Now, with the by statement used, your data doesn't need to be sorted anymore. There is no need for the proc sort anymore. It will actually spread across the threads and across the workers with the group. So the data in CAS, think of it that it's already sorted. Because it's in memory, it's able to do that. And just a few other takeaway points. CAS util is your way to load, unload, and manipulate data where it is in CAS on the disk and how it should be loaded, dropping out, and otherwise. And again, the message equal I is your key to understand where your SAS 9 code is running. And we are pretty much out of time. Yep, we're out of time. And I included in the last slides here, the slides will be published, links to the documentation. So at this point in time, anyone, any questions? You could just unmute yourself and ask it, or you could put in chat.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I've got some. Are we able to run CAS in the SAS Studio?
Yes.
Which we can run on the virtual machine on our own personal machines.
I see. Okay, so it depends where your SAS Studio is. If your SAS Studio is running on VIA, which wouldn't be on your local machine most likely, then within that SAS Studio you can connect to CAS and run it. if you have the SAS 9.4 installed on your local machine and it has a SAS Studio, you could still integrate it through certain connection options. It's important that your SAS installed on your machine would be, I think, at least M6 or M7. Then within the system options, you can specify the location of CAS and other connection properties, and you will be able to think of it like a remote submit code to CAS from your local machine. But that requires a bit of configuration work.
Okay. Just another one. Does this replace the functionality of the memlib option in SAS work? Did you ever use that?
The memlib historically been available only on Windows. Does it replace it? It's
sort of the same thing, running stuff in a temporary
yeah.
in memory.
Yeah, with the memlib, what it was doing by default, it would be your work library that would be cached into memory, and then you limit the size of how much memory you would like to allocate to this in-memory library, significantly improving performance. And that would work for all of your SAS-based code. Alternatively, you could cache datasets with a memcache statement as well, which then apply to pretty much any library and any dataset that you touch in SAS 9. With CAS, it doesn't completely replace it. Technically speaking, you could still use some of the caching techniques, and I will work on a compute part here. With CAS, moving it into memory, you still need to think about that original loop. Is when you work with the in-mem data libraries on SAS 9, you didn't need to think about where is my data, how do I persist it, how do I make changes, how do I save it, and so on and so forth. Now, when you work with CAS, you have to think about how do I load it into memory. I made the changes, I would like to persist it, share it, and so on and so forth. With the mem libraries, you didn't need to do that. So not completely replacing it, different way of working with it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Anyone else for anyone? This was one of my fastest presentations. This is 47 slides in 20 minutes. I'm surprised nobody else has any more questions. I see a lot of SAS people like Angus and Peter. Do you guys have anything additional to add to anything I mentioned in the slides?
I'm afraid I missed most of this, Vasilij. I've had real problems with my PC today, so I've only just managed to join.
Ah, okay.
But I'd be very interested to have a look through the slides because this is still an area I'm finding out about.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been using CAS in Anger recently on large government projects, we say, yeah, you can do some Fed SQL things, and you go, well, that was quick, because they're all in memory across a few worker nodes, and it just blasts through some things. So it's quite it's a change, and you do have to remember this whole library stuff, but it's kind of, you know, people who've been around a while and have done remote submit type stuff, it's kind of, it's a similar-ish kind of thing. You're thinking this code is running kind of somewhere else, but it's the same. So I just need to think about, you know, what my libraries are and where things are, and then the whole, yeah, session level versus what's it, global. Yeah, you have to keep an eye on that. The one, and as ever with SAS, you find there are a number of different ways of doing things. So you can load tables from SAS into CAS, all sorts of ways, and you get sometimes subtly different results depending on how you do it. So you can data step things in, or you can CAS util them in, and so on and so forth. And you could, and you also have SAS libraries that are pointed to CAS, which isn't quite the same thing as a CAS library in CAS, because it gets a bit interesting when you've got a CAS library sat on top of, let's say, an Oracle database, and you also have a SAS library pointing at the same database. When I say SAS, I mean Spree. And they will see subtly different things, because obviously CAS is in memory, whereas SAS is looking at what's in the database, and some things may be in memory but not in the database, and some things may be in the database and not in memory, and some things may be both. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, you get used to it.
And you touched on a point of in database. So if your SAS library pointing directly at Oracle within your normal compute session here, you can submit a data step. That data step will, in implicit way, get translated to the SQL code, submitted to Oracle, and you get back the query results. Now with CAS, you don't have any other way but to actually bring either the whole data set in, or first pre-process it, put it somewhere else on a file system, and then load it in. For some users, that finding a little bit frustrating because they're so used to, I just submit a data step, I get my results, I want to know my subtotal, I get the Oracle, handle it. Why do I need to bring the whole thing into memory first?
Yeah, and you can, and the other thing, if you've ever worked with things like Greenplum, there's a lot of analogies with Greenplum's way of dealing with data. You know, it's distributed across the worker nodes, and you can actually tell it how to distribute it. So you can get into all sorts of cunning around primary key, foreign key, distribution strategies across worker nodes to, you know, to get every last single drop of performance out of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the environment I'm working on at the moment, which is rather terrifying, has about 7 terabytes of RAM in it, which is just, you know, what far-flung future were we living in where the servers you've got 7 terabytes of RAM to play with? It's just like unfeasible, but fairly casual these days in some environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I could think of another environment that's also just about that big. Yeah, it's to do with the bank operating in 4 countries, but that's how they run. Yeah. And you did touch on a very important point. With the CAS, you cannot control how you distribute the data across the worker nodes. So I mentioned already there's an option for highly available distribution. That is, data is duplicated. So if one of the workers down, the data is still available. But that consumes the valuable memory. But then, you know, you mentioned the Greenplum. I remember Netezza technology, similar to Greenplum. Greenplum is open source, openish source version of it. Yeah, and we transformed a pharmaceutical company, their processing away from SAS data sets, the one that would take 3 hours to like 40 seconds. And that 40 seconds would very much depend on how you distribute the data across these multiple nodes. You don't do your distribution right, you don't see any performance queries. And then suddenly you start thinking, okay, I work with data, but I need to know what my user is going to be asking. Because once I know the question that they ask, then I can distribute the data correctly.
Well, now here's another thing. I mean, you look at things from Studio, but if you flick over to things like data management, you can do profiling on data sets in CAS, and that's really great. You can get the regex patterns that the VAT fields have got, the uniqueness and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's not rocket science, but it's just there, and you know, knowing what the data's up to is always helpful. So, and then of course you can also flick over to VA. So something people sometimes say, where is the exact equivalent of Enterprise Guide in VIA? And it's kind of in a lot of different places at the same time. I think nowadays it's you've got your code, you know, code creation and what have you in Studio, and visualization and graphs in VA, and flicking back and forth between them, or even having multiple tabs open, which is a fun thing. Is you can have a field day.
Yeah, and you know, another benefit, of course, in-memory processing is nothing new to SAS. Laser been around for a while, but we migrated from one of the customers from Visual Analytics on SAS 9.4 to VIA, and one of the reasons, some of you know, Laser, once it's full, your whole VA unfortunately just comes down crashing. And with CAS, that's not a problem anymore. With CAS, it's intelligent enough. So I mentioned we loaded 700 gigabyte of data within 2 hours, and that's great. But we actually got only 0.5 terabyte across both workers of memory. Now, how were we able to do that? Because CAS can intelligibly cache it back onto the disk on SSD, and in the cloud you could use onboard SSDs for that, and it will manage the cache in an intelligent way where it will keep in memory the most recent used data set, and what wasn't used, it will dump it quietly back on SSD. And next time you refer to it, yes, it will take a little bit longer, but because of the memory map format, it will bring it back in. So suddenly you could make it available in memory data sets for your users much more than you have the memory. And the CAS will take care of intelligibly surfacing what's used most often. Because really 80-20 rules applies. 20% of data sets only used 80% of the time.
Yeah, well, again, you do have to get into the classic space of sort of managing the common ground, lest it turn into a tragedy, so to speak. Because well, people will merrily fill things up. So there's even more perhaps a call for work intimately with the user base and in sort of both directions to try and optimize your data. Don't if people need to make a copy, find out why they couldn't have done something else instead and help them do that if you can. Yeah.
That probably will never go away. That's always going to
no indeed. That's just any kind of, you know, file servers, whatever you call some sort of shared resource will always fill up unless you people keep an eye on it, housekeeping and all that.
Absolutely. John, you wanted to ask another question?
Yeah, the lib names. You said that. What happens if you use a CAS lib name for the same one as you've got a SAS lib name already? Which one takes precedence, and how does it work?
Both of them will work at the same time. So you can perfectly have your normal lib name pointing to the same location where CAS pointing as well.
Okay, so it's not two different libraries as such.
They will work for you as two different libraries. So you could refer to the normal libref that pointing to one file system, and to the same file system you could point with the CAS backed up by another libref on the back of it. And in one case, you will load data straight into CAS. In another one, your data step or procSQL will be given to the compute context to execute. But you could perfectly run it in parallel.
Yeah, it just seems like you'd want to be, for your own, everybody's sanity, it probably doesn't make sense to try and have two libraries with the same name that are different to each other and different contexts can talk to them. Because yeah, I'm a preacher on the topic of obviousness, and having things that require thinking about when you're looking at them late at night trying to fix things is never a great idea. Quite what the naming convention could be for this is a SAS library looking at something, and this is the CAS library that looks at the same thing, but they're different. Exactly. I don't know, because you've only got 8 characters to play with, sadly. At least in Studio, you can have CAS libraries in other tools that have longer names and spaces in them, etc. But those are CAS, you know, CAS and via utilities only, like VA, etc. And then you can't get at them in the same way via code because of the 8-character thing. So it's
Yeah, if your CAS lib is a longer name, then you have to use this top version on the current slide assignment, and you have to be explicitly specifying it then to you know, John, you made me think about something. One unique property about CAS library, not many people know it. If you have a folder structure, so one folder within another folder within another folder, now with CAS intelligent enough, you could specify to include all the files from subfolders, something you couldn't do before with the SAS 9 libraries. So if you have
not just all subfolders, you could do multiple folders, but you had to list them out, didn't you? It was a bit of it's slightly mad idea, because then you don't quite know where's the file going to go when you write it there. But
but you can include the subfolders. I stand corrected. It's not whole. It's you can include subfolders, but yeah. Okay, I think we're out of time. So unless anyone has any other questions, we're going to close it off.
A very brief one. Sorry. A very brief one, Vasilij, Anthony. In your migration experience, I'm wondering, have you come across more of the coding side of things as opposed to the data handling? So someone's got quite sophisticated analytical programming that is pretty quick, but it still takes a bit of time compared to where it was before. And they might be thinking, how would this perform if I run it on CAS? And they might, it might have macros in there and ODS and all this kind of stuff.
There is one rule of thumb. If you're processing a lot of data in your analytical exercise, then CAS tend to perform faster once you load the data in. But if it's a small amount of data, keeping it on SAS 9 tend to perform faster without getting into that loop. But really, and I think Angus will agree with me, it's down to experimentation. You have to experiment and see which one works best. But CAS particularly good at processing huge amounts of data, and you will almost always win out on performance.
Thanks.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
Anyone else for anything else? What do you think about this format? Does it work? This is our first meetup session in quite a while with the Zoom and meetups and lunchtime. Is it? How do you find it?
It's okay.
Yeah, good for me.
It's good for me. Look forward
Excellent.
to more.
Yeah. Yeah, Maxine did offer to post the beers to everyone, but then we decided not to do so. But Maxine, thank you very much for all the beers you got to us in 199.
Unfortunately, we're not allowed to post alcohol because it's against SAS. I don't know, whatever.
Policy, yeah.
So apologies, guys. We'll just have to hold on until we can meet up in person again and have a beer together.
Is that?
Maybe we could send out a packet of nuts as long as nobody's allergic.
Yeah. Maxine, can we benefit from the backlog of all the beers we haven't consumed?
Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. That might be quite a big meetup if we do that.
It will be very popular, I think. Absolutely.
One thing I'd say out from using Studio and Anger recently is the snippet stuff is really good, and you can customize them and add your own and sort of assign keyboard shortcut macros for them. So, you know, I've got one at FedSQL, drops in the sort of the start and stop, beginning and end of a FedSQL statement, and then you can just put your SQL in the middle rather than having to type all the bits at the top and the bottom. The only downside, I think, to CASL and SAS with CAS is there's a lot of typing at times, but you can encapsulate that inside macros and or snippets to sort of tidy it up, so to speak.
Absolutely, yeah. We got one of the clients, a university in London, and another thing that I discovered while doing that project, the shortcuts to the files on the file system, you could specify them in a variety of ways. There's also a config file where you could provide that, include like a username into it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that was useful for this particular university because they use SAS for teaching. They also wanted to. It's good, and they want
students though, I guess, and yeah.
Well, it's actually master students for the business analytics. Yeah, and they had a very specific requirement that the students shouldn't be able to see each other files from the SAS Studio, but the lecturers will be able to see everyone else's files. And with a little bit of Linux trickery with the permissions and those shortcuts within SAS Studio, we've been able to implement exactly that. Nice. And also that a particular place the tutor can then share with everyone for the data to begin the exercise with. Yeah.
Cool. Yes, of course, that's Bill's thing, I suppose. Via is Linux only backend, so but that's good.
Well, it's a learning curve for some of the organization, but yeah, it's moving in the right direction.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I think this first meetup for a while been a real success. Great to see so many people. Great to see so much interaction. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vasilij.
Yeah, thanks.
I haven't had a chance to join you in person before, so this is great. Thanks.
Well, you
We're all
missed
looking
out a
forward
lot.
to getting back to 199, I guess, at some point.
Absolutely.
Whenever that is. Yeah.
As soon as the British government allows us to.
Oh, yeah. Maybe in time for Christmas.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And toes. Everything crossed.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.